Welcome to the History Unplugged podcast, the unscripted show that celebrates unsung heroes, myth-busts historical lies, and rediscovers the forgotten stories that changed our world. I'm your host, Scott Rank. In early 1942, while most of the American military was in disarray from the devastating attacks on Pearl Harbor and the Philippines, a single U.S. Army Air Force squadron advanced to the far side of the world to face America's new enemy. Based in Australia with poor supplies and no ground support, the pilots and crew faced tropical diseases while confronting the numerically and technologically superior Japanese forces. The outfit, which was dubbed the Kangaroo Squadron, proved remarkably resilient and successful. They conducted long-range bombing raids, armed reconnaissance missions, and rescued General Douglas MacArthur and his staff from the Philippines. Today I'm talking with Bruce Campbell, author of Kangaroo Squadron, American Courage in the Darkest Days of World War II. He was inspired to write the book by his uncle, a navigator in the squadron. A footlocker contained his military papers and other memorabilia, including a handwritten diary with day-to-day details of his tour. And there's all sorts of artifacts that live on from the Kangaroo Squadron. When a B-17E bomber crashed into a swamp on the north coast of Papua New Guinea in February 1942, on the first Kangaroo Squadron mission, the 9-member crew survived, escaped to safety, and returned to combat after traveling 5 weeks over land through the jungle. This plane, called the Swamp Ghost, remained submerged in water and tall grass until 2006, when it was restored, and now it's a main attraction in the Pacific Aviation Museum at Pearl Harbor, which you can see today. So a lot to unpack in this episode, and I hope you enjoy this discussion with Bruce Campbell. Bruce, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Your book focuses on an interesting period in World War II, or at least begins in one. This is shortly after Pearl Harbor and well before I suppose we could say, the triumphal period of the war for the United States. As the Kangaroo Squadron forms, or the conditions that cause it to form, could you describe what America's mood was in early 1942 in the beginning of World War II?
Early 1942, we're actually, after Pearl Harbor, then the mood, I would say, had changed considerably in a pretty short time. Prior to the Japanese attacks on Pearl Harbor and the Philippines and Malaya, that opened what they called their Southern Offensive, the mood in the United States was still one of isolationism. And most people wanted to stay out of the war. Everybody thought that World War I, which they called the Great War back then, had been the war to end all wars, and there was still a lot of national sentiment to stay out of other people's trouble, not spill American blood over what was happening in Europe and elsewhere. So a lot of Americans were pretty naive. They didn't even know where Pearl Harbor was located, by and large. So then when the attack came and it broke with such shocking news, then of course we as a country were thrust into a war overnight, and people had to grapple with that in any way they could. For a lot of young Americans, that meant military service, and there were queues at the recruiting offices for young men to sign up. Young women did too, and there were a lot of jobs for everybody. But so in early 42, there was this mood of, I would say, revenge, the attack on Pearl Harbor. There's a lot of anger, much like after Osama bin Laden and the attacks on the Twin Towers and Pentagon and so forth in 9/11. So a lot of parallels there. But of course, this is military action, one nation warring against us. So I think it didn't take long for the United States to realize that this is going to go global, and it was going to involve everybody, not small groups of people. So that would kind of be the prevailing mood in early 42. Interestingly, though, the guys who were in the Kangaroo Squadron had all joined up in the military before Pearl Harbor. So they were not among those young men or women who joined up after the attack. They had joined during the Depression. They were looking for good jobs back in those days, and jobs in the Army Air Corps and then later the Army Air Forces were popular because they paid pretty well. So all of the guys in the Kangaroo Squadron literally were in the service before America got into World War II.
And can you describe how the Kangaroo Squadron forms? For me, at least, my knowledge of early World War II is hazy before the Pacific theater really starts to heat up with the Battle of Midway, etc. The only thing I really know is the Doolittle raid, the retaliatory attack on Japan that seemed to be more about psychology than any long-term military strategy. So how does the Kangaroo Squadron form?
It really does, again, go back to prior to the Japanese attacks, when America is feeling some pressure from different factions. You know, Great Britain needs help because they're embroiled in a war with Nazi Germany. France and Poland and Central Europe had already fallen by 1940. So let's just say a year before Pearl Harbor, going into early 1941, the United States still has this isolationist attitude, but there's a lot of pressure and a lot of warning signs that we may not be able to stay out of a war. And Congress votes to mobilize. President Roosevelt pleads for this, and Congress listens, and they authorize the funding for the U.S. to mobilize. And so really shortly after Hitler attacked Europe in 1939, the United States did start to build its military. But you have to remember the military was really pathetic in the mid-30s. And so building it was going to take a long time and a lot of effort. We almost had to start from scratch. So by the time 1941 came along, we had been building our military for a couple of years, but it was such a slow process that we were still not prepared for military action when the Japanese attacked. So prior to that attack, there was a big need recognized to bolster our defenses in the Far East. I mean, Japan was rattling its sabers, and most of the politicians and diplomats could see that there would be trouble in the Pacific eventually. So there was money set aside to bolster American forces in the Philippines, which included sending a couple of wings of heavy bombers over to Clark Field and other bases over on Luzon. And the goal was to have them there by early 1942. So remember, this is before the surprise attack, when we thought we would have time to prepare. And so the Kangaroo Squadron actually grew out of a movement by the Army Air Corps and Army Air Forces to move lots and lots of planes over to the Philippines. On December 6th, prior to the attack, a couple of squadrons left the San Francisco area, a place called Hamilton Field, on an overnight flight to Hawaii, where they planned to refuel, arm the bombers, and then continue on to the Philippines. That flight left California in the evening of December 6th, and it arrives at 8 o'clock in the morning, just as the first wave of the Japanese attack begins. I mean, how's that for coincidental timing?
Wow.
You couldn't have. Yeah, and so that's actually how the war starts for not only the United States, but for about half the members of the Kangaroo Squadron. They literally fly right into the Japanese attack just by coincidence. They have 12 bombers. They're unarmed. They have guns aboard, but they're not mounted, and they didn't carry ammunition even if they did mount the guns. So they were defenseless. All 12 did get down on the ground, but a couple of them cracked up. There was one mortal injury and a bunch of others wounded. But for the most part, the planes all got down okay. And then they ended up flying patrols, joining the Hawaii Defense Forces and flying shipping and submarine patrols for a couple of months after the attack on Pearl Harbor. And finally, then the Joint Chiefs of Staff and Admiral King, who is the head honcho of the Navy, and General George Marshall, who was the head honcho of the Army, realized that we had to start making some kind of move out towards Australia and the Western Pacific and South Pacific if we were going to do anything to counter the Japanese. And the Kangaroo Squadron grew out of that directly as an ad hoc unit of 12 bombers, not the same 12 that went into Pearl Harbor, but 12 different airplanes with some of the same crews that had come into Pearl Harbor on December 7th. For the purpose of supporting an aircraft carrier task force centered around the USS Lexington that was guiding or escorting convoys down into the South Pacific. So this squadron was going to go fly out of Fiji and support that carrier group with long-range patrols. And then from there, they went on to Australia and flew the first American attack on a Japanese stronghold of Rabaul in New Britain. So that's kind of how the squadron got its start, and it ended up arriving in Australia in February of 1942.
Right. What they're doing is really, it's very important to what happens in the Pacific after Pearl Harbor, because everyone's heard of Pearl Harbor, but what gets overshadowed, but is probably of more important military significance, is all the islands that Japan occupies almost immediately after the Pearl Harbor attack. Guam, all sorts of other Pacific islands. And I had a great uncle who was stationed on Guam when Japanese occupation came in. Is this why the Kangaroo Squadron is in Australia? It sounds like they originally planned to be in the Philippines. Were they diverted because of the military realities of the Pacific?
Yes, and more specifically, the Japanese attacks on the Philippines were so devastating that as soon as the number of wrecked planes and survivors and everything else, as soon as those numbers began to come in, the powers that be realized that the Philippines were lost almost right from the beginning. No matter what MacArthur was saying, he was the boss over there, but no matter what he was saying, it became pretty clear that trying to reinforce the Philippines would be a lost cause. So the planes that had been intended to go to the Philippines, yes, they ended up being diverted to Australia, and the Kangaroo Squadron was the first of them, the first combat-ready unit to cross the Pacific after Pearl Harbor. So that's something pretty unique about it. Everything else militarily was going pretty badly for the United States, with a few small exceptions. And so really among the entire Army, including the Air Forces, this one small squadron of 12 planes was the first Army unit to go over for the purpose of initiating combat. Nobody else was quite ready yet to do anything in early February. So that's part of the answer to your question. And the other part is that, and you brought up an important point, is that we had to get across the Pacific somehow. And the Japanese, you're right, they captured Guam, they captured Wake Island. They had their sights set on attacking Midway later. And we had to find another way across the Pacific because Guam and Wake were now in Japanese hands. So what was called the Southern Ferry route was initiated. They actually started to construct it before the Pacific War began, and it was ready for use in January of 1942. So those 12 bombers ended up flying from Hawaii into the South Pacific and island hopping across these tiny little places like Palmyra and Canton Island and Christmas Island, these little tiny dots that nobody had even heard of before the war, working their way to Fiji and then to New Caledonia and then eventually to Australia. And it took a lot of logistics and planning, but they all made it across, and they were ready to attack the Japanese by the third week of February.
They probably set up a few cargo cults in their wake in some of these remote islands. So if anyone did, it was probably them.
They probably did. Yeah. No, that's true. I mean, these were just little remote, isolated places, and then all of a sudden now they're important logistic bases, and they